Essential components for defining an AP. Welcome, everyone. Before we dive into today's lesson, let's take a quick moment to recap what we have already covered. In our previous lessons, we established the fundamental definition of an arithmetic progression, or an AP, which is simply a sequence of numbers where the difference between any two consecutive terms remains constant throughout the entire sequence. Now, while knowing the definition is a great start, it isn't quite enough to actually create a specific sequence. Think about it. There are millions of different possible arithmetic progressions out there. To move from a general idea to building one specific, unique AP, and to distinguish it from all those other possibilities, we need what I like to call our building blocks. So, today, we're going to focus on the two essential pieces of information required to define an arithmetic progression completely. To lock in a single, specific sequence, you must have two specific components, the first term and the common difference. Over the next few slides, we will break down exactly what each of these represents and why you cannot have one without the other. 1. The first term, $1. The first term, which we denote by the letter A, or sometimes you might see it written as a sub-1, is essentially the starting point of our sequence. Think of it as the anchor. It tells us exactly where the progression begins on the number line. To put this into perspective, imagine you have a set of instructions on how to walk, but you haven't been told where to stand. You might have a rule for how many steps to take, but without a starting value, you have a rule for movement but no actual place to apply it. That is why the first term is so critical. It provides the foundation upon which the rest of the sequence is built. Now that we understand that an arithmetic progression requires specific building blocks, let's look at our very first essential component. 2. The common difference, $. Now that we have established our starting point with the first term, let's look at our second essential building block, the common difference. We denote this value with the letter D. Think of the common difference as the rule for movement. It is the fixed value that we add to any given term to arrive at the very next term in the sequence. This value is incredibly important because it determines the slope or the overall direction of our sequence. You can think of it as the engine that drives the sequence forward. First, if D is greater than 0, the sequence is increasing, meaning the numbers will get larger and larger as we progress. On the other hand, if D is less than 0, the sequence is decreasing, so the numbers will steadily drop. And finally, in the rare case where D equals 0, the sequence remains constant, meaning every single term stays exactly the same. In the next slide, we are going to see why we cannot rely on the common difference alone, and why we must pair it with the first term to truly define our progression. Why are both components necessary? Now, you might be wondering, if I know the rule for the sequence, why do I need both of these pieces of information? To really grasp why both the first term and the common difference are non-negotiable, let's look at what happens when we try to build a sequence while leaving one of these components out. First, let's look at scenario A. Imagine I give you only the first term, which we call A, and I tell you that A equals 5. That's all you know. Without a common difference, you're stuck. You could have a sequence like 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on, where the common difference D is 1. Or it could be 5, 10, 15, 20, where D is 5. It could even be a decreasing sequence like 5, 2, -1, -4, where D is -3. As you can see, because we don't know the value of D, there are actually infinite possible sequences that could start with 5. Now let's flip the script and look at scenario B. Suppose I only give you the common difference, D, and tell you that D equals 3. Again, we have a problem. We know the jump between numbers is 3, but we don't know where to start. The sequence could begin at 1, giving us 1, 4, 7, 10. It could start much higher like 10, giving us 10, 13, 16, 19. Or it could start in the negatives like -5, giving us -5, -2, 1, 4. Without the first term, we are essentially lost. So, what is our conclusion here? To uniquely identify one single, specific arithmetic progression, so that there is no confusion and no other possibilities, you absolutely must have both the first term, and the common difference, you need both the starting point and the rule for movement. Real-world example, a savings plan. Now that we understand the theoretical necessity of having both the first term and the common difference, let's move away from abstract numbers and look at a real-world application to see how these components work together in practice. Imagine a student who decides to start a savings plan using a piggy bank, adding money to it every single week. This is a perfect example of an arithmetic progression because the amount added is consistent. Let's break this down using the 3 steps we've discussed. First, we need to identify our starting point, or the first term, which we denote as A. In our scenario, the student begins by putting an initial amount of $50 into the piggy bank in the very first week. So, in this specific progression, our A equals 50. Next, we need to identify the common difference, which we denote as D. This is the fixed amount added each week. The student decides to add exactly $10 every subsequent week. Therefore, our D equals 10. Finally, step 3 is to construct the sequence. Now that we have both essential building blocks, the starting value and the constant rate of change, we can uniquely determine exactly how much money will be in the bank at the start of any given week. In week 1, we simply have our first term, A, which is 50. In week 2, we take our first term and add the common difference once, so A plus D, which is 50 plus 10, giving us 60. In week 3, we take the first term and add the common difference twice, which is A plus 2D, so 50 plus 20, resulting in 70. By week 4, we have A plus 3D, which is 50 plus 30, giving us 80. When we write this out as a complete sequence, the resulting arithmetic progression is 50, 60, 70, 80, and so on. As you can see, without both that initial $50 and that consistent $10 increase, we wouldn't be able to predict the future balance of the savings plan. Now, while this example uses positive numbers, keep in mind that the same logic applies even if the numbers are decreasing, which we will touch upon when we look at common mistakes to avoid. Common mistakes to avoid. First, many beginners fall into the trap of assuming that the common difference, which we call D, must always be a positive number. Remember, D represents the change between terms, and that change can certainly be downward. For instance, if our first term, A, is 100, and our common difference, D, is negative 10, our sequence would be 100, 90, 80, and so on. A negative D is just as vital to defining an AP as a positive one. It simply tells us the sequence is decreasing rather than increasing. Second, please be careful not to confuse the first term, A, with the nth term, which we denote as a sub n. While a sub n represents any general term at a specific position in the sequence, the essential component we discussed earlier, the one we need to anchor our sequence, is specifically the very first term, A. Always keep that distinction clear in your mind. Finally, do not fall into the trap of thinking that any 2 random numbers are sufficient to define an AP. Now, to be fair, if you're given 2 specific terms and you know exactly which positions they hold in the sequence, you can use algebra to calculate both A and T. However, if I just hand you 2 random numbers without telling you which one is the starting point or what the gap between them is, you won't be able to build the sequence. Now, before we wrap up today's lesson, I want to pause and highlight some common pitfalls that students often encounter when working with arithmetic progressions. It is very easy to fall into these traps, so let's look at 3 specific mistakes to avoid. Keep these points in mind as we move into our final summary of the key takeaways. Key takeaways. All right, we have reached the end of our lesson. Let's take a moment to recap everything we have covered today so that you can walk away with a clear understanding of how to define an arithmetic progression. First, let's remember the minimum requirements. As we discussed when looking at our various scenarios, you cannot define a specific AP with just one piece of information. To uniquely define an AP, you absolutely need 2 specific building blocks: the first term, which we denote as A, and the common difference, which we denote as T. Now let's look at the specific roles these 2 components play. Think of the first term, A, as your anchor. It acts as the starting point or the initial value of your sequence. Without it, we don't know where to begin. On the other hand, the common difference, d, acts as the constant rate of change between terms. It tells us the direction and the magnitude of our movement, whether the sequence is increasing, decreasing, or staying constant, just like we saw in our savings plan example. Finally, the most important concept to remember is uniqueness. If either a or d is missing, the sequence cannot be uniquely determined. Without a, we have a rule but no starting place. Without d, we have a starting place but no rule for movement. You must have both to identify one single, specific progression out of the infinite possibilities. I hope this summary helps solidify these concepts in your mind. Great job following along today.